For those of you who didn't join our last session, we are First Draft. We're an organization that tries to build tools and research to help people be more resilient against harmful and misleading information. We're really excited because this is a new course. This is our flexible learning course. It's a series of 13 different sessions that are all about vaccine misinformation. We talk about understanding the landscape of vaccine misinformation. We're going to talk soon about how to monitor it, how to do good, thoughtful, strategic search queries for it. We're going to talk about verification. We're going to talk about ethics and responsible reporting. So we have a lot planned for you today, but this is our second session of the series. They're all half an hour and they're all designed to be standalone as well. So if you missed the first session, that's totally fine. We hope that you walk away with a few interesting things that you learned today. So we're going to jump right into it. Today, we're talking about vaccine narratives and data deficits. So we're going to cover three things today. The first thing we're going to talk about is common vaccine narratives on social media. So last November, our organization put out a piece of research on vaccine narratives, categorizing the different narratives into different categories. So we're going to dive into those today. We're also going to talk about data deficits, so where there are gaps in quality information and how to fill them. And then the third thing we're going to talk about is oversupply. So what areas do we have too much information? If you're not familiar with me, if you're new here, my name is Shadene Arbani. I am First Draft's Partnerships and Programs Manager, and I'm based in New York. So let's get into it. So the name of our vaccine research, if you want to look it up, was called Under the Surface, COVID-19 Vaccine Narratives, Misinformation, and Data Deficits on Social Media. What we did was we analyzed 1,200 posts across different social media platforms that were talking about vaccines, and we put them into different categories based on the sort of the narrative that was being used to frame the post. And there were some interesting findings from that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the 6 categories that we found and some of the differences between them. And we're also going to give you examples of each of them. Now, what I'm about to do when we go through these 6 categories is throw a lot of different examples at you. And I understand that that can feel a little bit overwhelming in half an hour and sort of like, you don't know what to do with that information. Some of our other sessions are a lot more skills-based and practical skills oriented. This one is very conceptual. So as we're going through these 3 narratives, I want you to have 3 questions in mind, because I think thinking about these questions is going to make this information more useful. So the first question is, how does this help me understand the concerns that people have about vaccines? Or does this help me understand the concerns people have about vaccines? You all are joining from different locations, different countries, potentially different languages, and we're going to talk about some of the differences that we saw in different languages. So certain things may be more relevant to you than others, and that's okay. The second question I want you all to be asked to be thinking about when we go through these is, what kind of information would help you address these concerns? So one of the goals of these sessions is to help people be better communicators about vaccines and to get out better quality information. So how can what we learned today help us get out better quality information about vaccines? And then last but not least, what are some keywords I could use to research this topic further? So in our next session, we're going to be talking about keywords and search queries. So how do you do strategic searching on social media to find posts that are related about vaccines and to understand the discourse better? So as we're going through these, pay attention to the language that is used, because we're going to be talking about that in the next session. So let's get right into it. Across all the languages that we looked at, which were Spanish, French, and English, political and economic motives were one of the main frameworks that we saw that were being used to talk about vaccines on social media. So what are some examples of this? First of all, that concentrated financial interests drive vaccine development and undermine its safety. So essentially, people are worried about profits and how profits might be getting in the way of responsible vaccine development and safety. Another example of this is that leaders are promoting vaccines for political gain. A third example is that corrupt governments and media outlets serve as mouthpieces for big pharma. So we see a lot of discourse on social media about pharmaceutical companies and the interests of pharmaceutical companies. So here's an example of a tweet that sort of fits this narrative on the right. If we read this, it says, "Here's how a sweetheart deal from US government to big pharma works. 1, don't test on pregnant women. 2, later, when there are problems, don't pay. Big pharma is now 40 times bigger since government granted no liability for vaccine manufacturers." So what's interesting to me about this tweet is if we're thinking about keywords, there are a lot of keywords we can pay attention to in this tweet that help us understand some of the concerns that people have about vaccines. She talks about sweetheart deals from the US government. She talks about big pharma. That's another term. She also talks about pregnant women. So clearly there are concerns out there about the effect that the vaccine has on pregnant women, right? So these are all things to pay attention to. The next big category that we saw framing vaccine discourse, and this should come as no surprise, is safety, efficacy, and necessity. So what are some examples of this? First of all, the idea that the COVID-19 vaccine is a ticket back to normality. Another popular narrative we saw is that a healthy immune system is more powerful than a vaccine. Another thing we saw is mRNA vaccines and GMOs aren't safe. So there's a lot of concern about mRNA as a technology for vaccines, and also ingredients in vaccines and what's in them. And then a fourth narrative is that, well, you poison your body with drugs and alcohol, so surely you can take the vaccine. So these are some of the popular things that we've seen related to safety. A third category we've seen has to do with development, provision, and access. So some examples of this: that Russia has won the race to find a COVID-19 vaccine. So we see a lot of discourse on social media about the sort of the geopolitics of the vaccine and the race to develop a vaccine between countries. And one important thing that I really want to say is we didn't include this as an example because we're making some kind of judgment about the Russia vaccine Sputnik. And in fact, there has been some really recent positive reporting about Sputnik. The Lancet, for example, recently ran a piece that had some positive things to say about Sputnik. The reason we include it is just because this conversation about who's winning the race to vaccine development was something that we saw very much of, especially a few months prior. Another example of something that falls into this category is that provision of vaccines around the world is inequitable. Now, this is probably true, but the reason we include it is because it's something that people are talking about, and it's also an example that could possibly be weaponized in the future. For example, you might imagine someone using this point to say, well, if we need everyone to be vaccinated in order to deal with COVID, then what's the point? Because we're never going to have everyone vaccinated, right? So it's important to think about how these different narratives, positive or negative, could be used to weaponize information about vaccines. Another category that we saw was conspiracy theory. So conspiracy theories about the vaccine have really proliferated across social media. And one interesting thing about this category is that it's something that we saw very prevalent in French-speaking discourse. So some examples of vaccine conspiracy theories are that vaccines will microchip and control entire populations. Another example is that vaccines are tools for depopulation. So again, if we're thinking about keywords and language and words we can look at and pay attention to in order to research vaccine discourse more, these are some examples you might want to pay attention to. Microchip, for example, or depopulation. Population control is another term that we've seen a lot. So if you're interested in researching vaccine conspiracy theories, it can be good to pay attention to the language that people are using. And we're getting to the end of the different narratives that we've seen, but another one that was prevalent, especially in English-speaking discourse, was liberty and freedom. So this idea that it starts with a mask, moves to vaccines, and ends in total control. Or that mandatory vaccines are railroading our rights and freedoms. So, the thing that's interesting here language-wise is that although liberty and freedom is a category that we saw a lot of in English-speaking discourse about the vaccine, it's not something we found any examples of in Spanish. And of course, our research was very qualitative, and we're, in our research, we're making personal judgments about which posts fall into which categories, and some may fall into multiple categories, but it was very stark and surprising to us that we couldn't find any examples of liberty and freedom in the Spanish-speaking discourse. On the other hand, morality and religion was a category that was very prevalent in Spanish-speaking posts about the vaccines. So some examples of this: that the blood of Christ is the only vaccine against COVID-19. Or on the positive end of the spectrum, that God has the power to enlighten scientists to discover a coronavirus vaccine. So you can see there are some very interesting differences in languages and how people in different languages are talking about vaccines on social media. So I know that that was a lot of examples, but I think that we really have two goals here. The first goal is to be better communicators. So if you were here for our last session, or if you weren't, we talked a lot in the first session about trust in vaccines. And we looked at a couple different case studies from around the world about why certain communities had lost trust in vaccines. And what was interesting from those case studies that we looked at is that we saw that, one, people had some very valid concerns for having lost trust in vaccines. And number two is that those concerns were different across different communities. So, in all of these examples we gave, what's clear is there are a lot of different reasons that people are concerned about vaccines. It's not just that people are, sort of across the board against vaccines as a health intervention. A lot of people are just concerned about the politics of vaccine development, right? A lot of people are concerned about how civil liberties may be affected. So the point here is that if you want to get better quality information out about vaccines, it helps to know which concerns your audiences have. Because if you're writing or reporting or putting information about vaccines, but you're not addressing the specific concerns of your readers or your viewers or your audience, then that's a missed connection, right? And then the other goal is to be better researchers, right? So it's easier to research vaccine discourse on social media if if your mind is open to all the different forms that vaccine discourse can take. And also, if you know how to identify different keywords and the language that people are using to talk about vaccines. So that's why we talk about these examples. But let's talk about something a little bit different now. So this next part of the session is about data deficits. So what is a data deficit? Basically, data deficit is the fancy word we use to refer to what happens when there isn't enough credible information to meet demand. So some examples of data deficits with regards to the COVID-19 vaccine. So mRNA technology and DNA alteration. We have found in our research that there are a lot of questions about these topics, and there isn't a lot of good quality information. So when you research these topics, like as an average person, not as a scientist, just asking questions about them, we find that the search results that you get, there is a limited amount of good quality information, and there's a proliferation of really misleading information. Another example of a place where there's a gap in quality information is GMOs and aluminum. So the ingredients of the vaccines, what's in the vaccine, people have a lot of questions about that. And then thirdly, legal impunity for pharmaceutical companies. So everyone wants to know what legal impunity means. As we said before, there are a lot of concerns about pharmaceutical companies. There are a lot of concerns about how profits and economic gain may be interfering with vaccine development. So people want to understand what these terms mean and how it might affect the safety of the vaccine. So how did data deficits emerge? So this is sort of a little chart. So basically the idea is that a novel or a previously niche issue surfaces. So something happens that we didn't previously know much about, right? Then a number of people logically have legitimate questions about the information, and they have legitimate questions about the information provided, and the amount of quality information provided is low. It's dominated by misleading, confusing, even harmful information. So this is where a deficit emerges. Then what happens is that malicious actors exploit the deficit by spreading false or misleading claims. And then these messages are laundered through the information ecosystem thanks to a variety of manipulation tactics. So how do we fight this, right? So there are two steps. One is to understand how data deficits can be exploited. So what we find is when there are gaps in quality information, a number of things happen. One is that bad information is duplicated and translated across multiple languages. Another thing that often happens is that the information provided is modified to obfuscate the source. So it can be a big, one of the things that we see across the board with misinformation is that it often obscures where the source of the information is. That's why we say in all of our trainings, if you're trying to help people get access to good information, if you're trying to build confidence in reporting and institutions that are doing, doing good quality news and getting out good information, help people understand how to look at primary sources, right? Because one of the tactics that we see in misinformation is that they're hiding the source of the information so that they can modify and change something about it. And then often what we see is that this bad information then gets spread across multiple platforms. So probably the most important thing that we can do if we're trying to get good information out about the vaccines is to be able to identify when there's going to be a gap in quality information. So it's a little bit of predictive work, but there are ways that we can do this. One is to think about what topics are new or previously unknown, because those are the topics that are going to have a lag in quality information. Another thing to think about is what topics are technically complex, right? That's the issue with COVID and vaccines and science reporting in general, is that it's technically complex. It's difficult to report in general. Another thing to think about is, does a topic align with pre-existing narratives? So thinking about the narratives we just talked about, could this topic fit into one of those narratives? Because that's an indication to you that it's something that's, going to be compelling to people. Another thing to look out for is whether a topic is politically significant, because again, people are really concerned about political motives that are potentially shaping vaccine development. And then two other things to think about are whether a topic is emotionally charged or whether it's just a topic that has legitimate questioning. These are all things to look out for. So 3 practical tips. The first is do a search on Google or YouTube on a particular topic and look at the results. If you do a search, for example, for vaccine injury on YouTube, one of the things that we found is that there are a lot of stories, both positive about vaccines and negative, that are really just anecdotal. They tell people's personal stories. And, that can be interesting, but it can also be very unhelpful to someone who is trying to put the risks of vaccine injury into context, right? People want to understand, how is this going to affect me? What are the risks for me, right? So look at the results for different terms on social media and see whether the reporting that shows up is giving good answers to the questions that people have. Another thing that you can do is bolster your social media presence. So do an Ask Me Anything on Reddit, or maybe Reddit isn't popular in your location, and Facebook and Instagram are popular. And maybe you want to do a talk with your audience on Facebook or Instagram Live. There are ways to build your presence on social media, and that can really help sort of fight the misleading information that's proliferating on social media. And then lastly, avoid asking open-ended questions on social media. And if you do, have a moderator ready to offer fact checks in the comments. So we've found that asking open-ended questions on social media comments often leads to a proliferation of misinformation. So you want to be really careful that when you do that, you have someone to provide answers in the comment section. And then lastly, I just want to talk about oversupply. So where do we have too much information? Sometimes the sheer quantity of information can lead to confusion, and it can lead to news avoidance. And we've seen that a lot with the pandemic, just sort of people feeling overwhelmed by the amount of information. So there are a couple areas where we've identified that we have too much information and it's causing confusion. One of those is about information about vaccine development and trials. And specifically, what we've seen is that there's too much focus on the race to the vaccine and not enough contextual reporting that helps people make sense of it. Another thing we've seen is that an oversupply of reporting is based on press releases from pharmaceutical companies. So this can be quite damaging because, as we've seen before, people have a lot of concerns about pharmaceutical companies. So doing stories that are simply based on their press releases doesn't really help build trust with people who have those concerns. That's it for today. I know it was a lot of concepts and a lot of examples, but I hope it gave you some ideas for where the concerns in vaccines lie and where we could potentially be getting out better quality information and how. Next time, we're going to talk about keywords and search queries. So it's going to be a very practical session. We're going to talk about monitoring. We're going to talk about how to write search strings on different platforms. And we really hope that everyone attends this session because it's one of those things that is very, universally useful. You can use this to research vaccines. You can also use these concepts to do research on social media in general. So I'm really excited about that session. Here are some of the times that are available. As you may know, we have these sessions in 3 different time zones. So This is the North American time zone, but we also do a session at 1 p.m. GMT and also at 3 p.m. in the Australian and Asia Pacific region time zone. So here are some of the options. And then the next week, we're going to talk about how to monitor conversations on social media. So we're sort of going to talk about setting up systems for monitoring. If you're not aware, we have a whole new vaccine insights hub that we are really excited about. You can go to firstdraftnews.org/vaccine insights. We have vaccine narratives that our editorial team is tracking. We also have a link to sign up for our vaccine newsletter. We have search tips. We have all sorts of goodies on there, so please check it out.